There is a church in the Ozarks that no map will show you. The men who found it were not looking for it. The crew was running a survey line through a hollow so deep that the sun only reaches the floor of it for about 2 hours a day, in country where the trees grow close enough that a compass needle drifts and no one can tell you why. They expected rock. They expected timber and briar and maybe an old still gone to rust in the creek bed. What they found instead was a wall of dressed stone rising straight out of the leaf mould, cut so clean and fitted so tight that not one of them could work a knife blade into the seams. Above the door, carved into a single long block of lintel, was a mark that none of them knew, and none of them ever drew it the same way twice. That was the beginning of it. Inside of a year, 2 of those men were gone. Not buried, gone. And the road that was meant to run through that hollow was moved 3 miles east, quietly, at real cost, and the reason for it was never set down anywhere that a person like you was ever meant to read. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the church that Hollow gave up before the county buried, the record of it, the surveyor's own field sketches, the demolition order that was filed and then quietly unfiled, the names and dates of the men who went inside, and the account the last of them wrote out by hand before he stopped speaking. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. To understand what those men were standing in front of, you first have to understand the hollow itself, because the ground came before the building, and the ground was already wrong. The old survey books do not give the place a name. Every other fold of that country carries a word handed down from the first families who came in over the mountains, a Boxley or a Marble or a Cane, some plain settler word worn smooth by 100 years of saying it. This one carries only a number. On the earliest county plat it is marked as Hollow 9 in a careful hand, and on the plat drawn 30 years after that it is not marked at all. The survey line simply stops at the ridge above it and picks up again clean on the far side, as though the mapmaker reached that edge, lifted his pen off the paper, and decided the ground in between was not worth the ink it would take to draw it. People lived within an afternoon's walk of that hollow their whole lives, and never once climbed down into it. A woman named Aura Teal, who kept a store at the mouth of the valley into her 90s, told a young circuit preacher in the early 60s that her grandmother had drilled the same short rule into her before she was old enough to read. You do not go down into the 9th hollow after the light starts to go, and you do not carry a lantern that can be seen from the rim. She would not say what the rule was meant to protect a person from. When the preacher pressed her, she told him that her grandmother had never explained it either, and that the not explaining was part of the teaching, because a child who understood the reason might one day decide the reason had passed. The rule was built to outlast anybody's understanding of it. That, she said, was the point. So when the survey crew came down into the 9th hollow in the middle of the last century, cutting a line for a road that was supposed to open up the timber on the back side of the ridge, they were already breaking something older than the county they worked for. There were 6 of them. They went in at first light with chains and axes and a transit, expecting a hard day in bad ground and nothing worse than that. What they came out with, the ones who came out, was a thing none of them could carry and none of them could put down. What stopped them cold in that hollow was the stone. This was not the work of frontier hands, and every man on that crew knew it the moment he laid eyes on the wall. The people who settled that country built with what the country gave them. They notched logs at the corners and stacked chimneys out of river rock set in clay daub, and when they wanted something to last they used more of the same, only bigger. What rose out of the leaf mould in the 9th hollow was cut granite, squared and coursed and true, and there is no granite in that part of the Ozarks. Not in the creek beds, not in the bluffs, not for a great many miles in any direction a man could name. Somebody had carried every block of it in from somewhere else. Up ground so steep that a loaded mule can barely keep its own feet under it, over a rim that turned back wagons into a hollow that the maps refused to hold. Someone had hauled tons of dressed stone and set it without a road to bring it on, and they had cut each block to a tolerance that a mason with modern tools would sweat to match. The corners stood true. The courses ran dead level. Its whole front held plumb after who knows how many winters of the hillside leaning its full weight against it, trying patiently to push it back down into the earth it came out of. And when the crew ran their hands over the faces of those stones, they could not find a single tool mark anywhere on them. That is the detail that a stone cutter fixes on, because stone that fine is chiselled, and a chisel always leaves its record, a faint grammar of strikes that a trained eye can read like handwriting. There was none of it. No point work, no bush hammer, no drag of a tooth chisel across the grain. Every surface was smooth and slightly soft at the edges, the way a thing looks when it was not carved at all but shaped while it was still willing to be shaped. One of the men said out loud what all of them were thinking and wished he had not. He said the stone did not look cut, it looked poor. Then there was the mark above the door. The lintel was a single block longer than a man is tall, and set into the middle of it, deep and clean, was a figure that not one of the six could name. They were not ignorant men. Between them they had seen Masonic marks and cattle brands and the old German hex signs the settlers painted on their barns, and the church letters carved on 100 country headstones. This was none of those. Each man who tried to copy it into his notes drew it differently, and when they compared the pages that night by the fire, no two sketches agreed on how many lines it had or which way they turned. A shape you cannot copy is a strange thing to stand under. The eye takes it in, and the hand refuses to give it back, and after a while you begin to feel that the failing is not in your hand, but in the shape, that it was made on purpose to slip out of any record a person might try to keep of it. The rodman wrote in his log that he stared at it until his eyes watered and still could not have told you, with a knife at his throat, whether it was 1 mark or 2 marks touching. It was the way the building faced that finally told them what they were looking at. A church, any church raised by the people who came into those mountains with a Bible and an axe, faces the way the whole Christian world had faced for more than 1,000 years. The door takes the western light, and the far end, the altar end, points east toward the sunrise, toward the old and hopeful idea of the returning morning. Every meeting house in that country was laid out to that compass, without anyone having to be told, the way a plant leans at a window. The building in the 9th hollow did none of that. Its one door opened to the north, into the coldest and darkest quarter of the whole sky, into the single direction that the sun never once crosses from the day a man is born to the day he dies. This was not an accident of the ground or a mistake of some backwoods builder who did not know better. Whoever raised it knew exactly what a church was supposed to do and where it was supposed to point, and they built the deliberate opposite of it, stone by careful stone, facing the dark on purpose. And when the crew finally worked the door open, swollen and heavy, and grinding on hinges that should have rusted to nothing but had not, and their lanterns went in ahead of them into the still air, the first thing the light fell across was a set of stairs. Not stairs up to a loft or a bell, stairs going down. The floor those men were standing on was not the bottom of the building at all, it was the middle of it. Most of that church was under the ground, and it had been under there so long that the hill had risen up over the lower windows and closed over them like water closing over a stone. Before we move on to what they found at the bottom of those stairs, stop for a second. What you just heard about the way that church was built is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the surveyor's own field notes. The buried lower floor, the northward door. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The stairs went down farther than the height of the whole building standing above them. The crew counted the steps on the way down, out of the plain habit that survey men have of counting everything, and when they came back up they could not agree on the number, and that small disagreement is the first of the strange things in a story that holds a great many of them. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a second room the same size and shape as the first, only this one had never in its life seen a single hour of daylight. The walls down there were not granite. They were older than the granite, and every man who touched them knew it the way you know a thing in your teeth before you know it in your head. The stone was a dark, tight grain that no one on the crew could put a name to, laid without any mortar at all, in courses so exact that the seams between the blocks ran like lines somebody had drawn with a straight edge. And it was cold. Not the ordinary cool of being underground, which is a steady, honest, root-cellar kind of cold. This was different. One of the men laid his bare palm flat against the wall and pulled it back before he had decided to, and he said afterward that the stone was not cold the way rock in a cave is cold. It was cold like a thing that takes the warmth out of whatever touches it, and gives nothing back, cold that seemed to reach up his arm after his hand was already gone. There were no pews in that lower room. There was no altar of any kind that the men could recognize, no cross, no rail, nothing that named the place as belonging to any god they had a word for. In the center of the floor there was a single low ring of the same dark stone, waist high on a grown man, worked perfectly round, and inside that ring the floor did not continue. It simply stopped at the inner edge of the stone and gave way to nothing. When they lowered a lantern to the lip of it on a length of chain, the light went down and found no bottom, no water, no wet gleam of a well, no far wall. It found only a darkness that did not scatter the way ordinary dark scatters when you put a flame to it, a darkness that seemed instead to sit up and lean toward the light and press against it like a held breath. 6 men went down those stairs. That number is not in any doubt, because it is written plainly in the one document that came through the years, a field log kept by the youngest man on the crew, a rod man of about 19 whose family a long while later handed the pages to a county historian on the single condition that his name be struck from them first. His writing in that log is steady, and even for the early entries, the ordinary bookkeeping of a working day, chain lengths and elevations and the weather, and then, part way down a page, it stops being steady. He wrote that 2 of the older men would not go near the ring at all, that they stood back against the stairs the whole time with their lanterns held high and their backs to the cold wall. He wrote that the oldest of them, a mason named Coy, who had cut and set stone his entire life and had a stonecutter's slow way of reading a wall, knelt down at the very edge of that ring for a long time without saying anything. And then, without turning around, still looking down into the nothing inside it, the old man said that the church had not been built to keep something out. It had been built to keep something down. And the door, he said, faced north so that whatever it was would have the shortest road up out of the cold when the day finally came that somebody let it up. The rodman wrote that they left before the light started to go, moving faster than they had come. He wrote that the 6 of them agreed among themselves, out loud, on the walk back up, that they would tell the county they had found an old cistern in the hollow and nothing more, and that they would say the ground was too broken to run a road through, which was true enough, and let it lie. And then in the log there is a gap of 4 days with nothing written in it. When the entries start again, the hand has changed, gone cramped and hard and pressed so deep it tore the paper in places, and the last full sentence any man ever read in that book says that the sound had followed him up out of the hollow. It was under the floor of his own house now, he wrote. It was patient, and it was learning the shape of his name. Within a year of that day, the 2 men who had knelt closest to the ring were gone out of the county, and no forwarding word ever came from either of them, and no bodies were ever found. The survey was abandoned. The road that had every reason to run straight through that hollow was bent 3 miles to the east instead, over rougher and steeper ground, at a cost the county could barely carry, for a reason that appears in no surviving meeting record anywhere, because the pages that would have held those months were taken out of the county book. Not lost, removed. Anyone can go and look at the book to this day, and the binding still holds the cut stubs where those sheets were sliced out with a sharp blade, close and deliberate, by a hand that knew exactly which pages it wanted gone. A demolition order was drawn up in that same stretch of time, an order to have the building in the 9th hollow pulled down and the whole of it filled in with rock and covered over, and that order carries a real date and a real filing number in the margin. And then, beside the number, a second notation shows that the order was pulled back out of the record before a single man was ever sent to carry it out. Somebody with the authority to decide such things decided that the safer course was not to destroy the church at all. It was to leave it exactly as it stood, sealed and unmarked and lifted off of every map that the county would ever print afterward, and to cut the memory of it out of the book so cleanly that in another generation no one would know there was anything to look for. This is the shape that the people who study these hollows have slowly learned to recognize, and it is the reason the 9th hollow is not the only place with a story like this one riding underneath it. Scattered back through those mountains, there are foundations of dressed and fitted stone that no settler on record ever had the tools or the reason to cut, standing in hollows and on ridges that no wagon could ever have climbed to. In places, the timber has been quietly reclaiming for longer than the country has had a name, and around every one of them a person finds the same three things waiting, no record anywhere of who built it or when. A local rule, worn smooth and handed down, that tells the children to keep away and does not tell them why, and a run of county history with the relevant pages cut clean out of the book. People have tried, once or twice across the years, to go back and find the church in the 9th hollow. A pair of young men out of a college up north went looking for it in the 70s with a hand-drawn map that one of them had bought off an old logger, and they came back out of the hills 2 days later without the map and without much wanting to talk about where it had gone. A forester walking timber lines in that country in the 80s said he came up on a rise of squared granite deep in a hollow that held its shade like standing water, and that an old red oak had grown straight up out of the roofline of the thing over what had to be centuries. He started to count the rings on a limb that had fallen and gone punky, to get a rough age on the tree and so on the building under it, and he stopped counting well before he was finished, and he did not go back the next day the way a curious man would. He drew his line somewhere else and marked that ground unworkable, and left it off his own map. The county historian, who was given the rod man's log, kept the pages in a drawer for most of his life, and showed them to almost no one. Near the end, he told a younger man that he had come to believe the church was older than any dating a person would be comfortable saying out loud, older than the settlers, older than the tribes who were in that country before the settlers, that it had been standing quietly in its hollow through whatever it is that comes along every so often and wipes the record clean and lets the survivors believe they were the first. He said the granite was not the strange part. He said the strange part was that somebody, a very long time ago, had thought it was worth the labour of a lifetime to build a heavy stone lid over one particular hole in the ground, and to point the only door away from the sun, and to trust that the people who came after would be frightened enough to leave it shut. The building is still down there. The hollow it sits in is still marked on nothing, still bent around by a road that goes the long way for no posted reason, still known to a small handful of old families who will change the subject the moment a stranger brings it up. Nobody has been back inside since the crew climbed out into the light and agreed among themselves to lie about a cistern. Nobody goes down into it now. The stone ring in the lower room is still open, still giving back no bottom and no sound and no reflection, and whatever the old mason believed was resting under it has had a great many quiet years down there in the cold to go on being patient and to go on learning. The people at the mouth of that valley still teach their children the old short rule, the same one Oratiel's grandmother taught her. They just no longer remember to say what it is for. And if you should ever find yourself running a line through country that the maps seem to step around on purpose, and you come up all at once on a wall of stone too fine for the hands that were ever supposed to have been there, cut without a mark and facing the wrong way into the dark, then the wisest thing you can do is the one thing those 6 men failed to do. Leave it in the ground. Fill your notes with something ordinary and forgettable, and walk back up toward the light while the light is still yours to walk toward.